The morning sun rose quietly over the thick jungles of the Solomon Islands. A light mist hovered above the palm trees, drifting lazily over a coastline still scarred by weeks of fighting. American Marines moved cautiously through the silent terrain, rifles ready, eyes scanning for movement. The sounds of war, gunfire, planes, explosions had faded just a few days earlier. Now, only the faint hum of insects and the distant crash of waves remained. Corporal James Turner wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stepped over the twisted remains of an old machine gun nest. The smell of burnt oil and metal still lingered in the humid air. His unit had been ordered to sweep through the abandoned Japanese positions on this part of the island, clearing any remaining traps or snipers. But what they were about to find was something no one expected. "Hey, Sarge!" one of the Marines shouted from ahead. "You'd better come take a look at this." Sergeant Miller hurried forward, boots sinking into the muddy ground. Beyond a thicket of bamboo and vines, in a small clearing, something metallic shimmered under the sunlight. The men slowly pushed through the foliage, and then stopped, staring in disbelief. Before them stood a Japanese fighter plane, perfectly intact. It looked like it had landed rather than crashed. Its slender wings stretched gracefully across the clearing, the rising sun emblem still bright on each side. The propeller was slightly bent, but the rest of the airframe appeared undamaged. The cockpit canopy was open, the seat empty. There was no pilot, no blood, no sign of struggle. Just silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. Turner finally broke the quiet. "What the hell is this thing doing out here?" Miller climbed up onto the wing, carefully looking inside. "It's one of theirs," he said, tracing the Japanese markings with his finger. "A-0 fighter. Haven't seen one up close before." The men gathered around, curiosity overtaking their caution. The Zero had been the terror of the Pacific skies for 2 long years. American pilots called it the Devil's Wings. Impossibly fast, impossibly agile, always one step ahead. To find one here, untouched, felt like discovering a ghost. Private Johnson circled the plane slowly, his hand brushing over the fuselage. "Looks so thin," he muttered. "Like it's made of tin foil." The sergeant frowned. "You're right. Where's the armor? Where's the plating?" He knocked his knuckles against the body of the aircraft. It made a hollow, almost fragile sound. Curiosity turned into disbelief as they examined it more closely. There was no armor protection around the cockpit, no bulletproof glass, not even metal shielding behind the pilot's seat. The fuel tank exposed, the control cables unprotected. The Marines exchanged uneasy glances. "How did anyone survive in this thing?" Turner asked softly. They began searching for clues. Inside the cockpit, they found a few personal items: a pair of flight gloves, a tattered map of the island, and a small photograph of a young woman in traditional Japanese dress. On the back, written neatly in kanji, were the words, "For honor and the Emperor." Miller held the photo in silence. "Guess he made it out," he murmured, "or didn't want to be found." The plane told its own story. A forced landing, maybe fuel exhaustion or engine failure. There were no bullet holes, no signs of fire. Perhaps the pilot had run out of fuel during combat and glided down, escaping into the jungle. The idea that such a fragile machine had ruled the skies was almost impossible to believe. Later that afternoon, the Marines radioed in their discovery. Within hours, a team of Navy intelligence officers and aircraft engineers arrived by jeep, their faces lit with excitement. They had been waiting months for a chance to study a real, intact Zero. Every piece of it could reveal secrets: how it climbed so fast, how it turned so sharply, why it always seemed to outmatch American planes early in the war. As the experts began their examination, Turner and his squad stood nearby, watching. The engineers touched the plane with reverence, almost disbelief. They removed a panel from the wing. It was astonishingly thin, just millimeters of lightweight aluminum alloy. One of the men whistled. "No wonder it's so fast," he said. "There's nothing here to slow it down." Another shook his head. "Or to protect it," he replied grimly. That evening, as the sun set in a crimson sky, the Marines made camp near the clearing. The once feared Zero stood quietly among the trees, its paint reflecting the dying light. Turner sat by the fire, lost in thought. He remembered stories from the pilots. Tales of dogfights where American planes emptied entire magazines into a Zero and still couldn't bring it down. Yet here it was, light as paper, delicate as a bird. Maybe its power hadn't come from its armor or weapons. Maybe it came from the men who flew it, men who didn't fear death. Turner looked again at the photo they'd found. A woman smiling, her eyes calm and proud. Somewhere out there, her pilot was gone, swallowed by the jungle or the sea. He had fought in a machine that offered no protection, guided only by his skill and his belief in something greater than himself. For the first time, Turner felt something unexpected, not hatred, but respect. The next morning, the Zero was carefully dismantled and flown out on a transport ship for study. But for those Marines, the image of that plane, silent, perfect, and haunting, stayed with them long after the war. It was a reminder that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it wears no armor at all. The year was 1940. Far across the Pacific, Japan was preparing for a new kind of war. One that would stretch across oceans and reach the skies. In a small hangar outside Nagoya, engineers worked day and night, driven by a dream, to create the most agile fighter aircraft the world had ever seen. The project bore a simple name, the Mitsubishi A6M0. Chief Engineer Jiro Horikoshi stood beside the gleaming prototype, his eyes filled with pride and exhaustion. He had been given an impossible order by the Imperial Navy: build a plane faster, lighter, and more powerful than any enemy could imagine. Yet, there was one condition: it had to be able to take off from an aircraft carrier. That meant every gram, every bolt, every sheet of metal had to be calculated with ruthless precision. In 1939, when the Zero first took to the air, the test pilots were stunned. The aircraft soared effortlessly, climbing to 6,000 meters in just minutes. It turned with the grace of a bird and landed with perfect balance. It was faster than any fighter in Asia and could outmaneuver even the best American and British designs of the time. Japan had built a machine that defied logic. By the summer of 1941, the Zero was ready for war. Painted in pale gray with the crimson-red sun on its wings, it became the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Its pilots, many of them veterans from China, called it Reisen, meaning Zero Fighter. To them, it was not just a machine but an extension of their soul. Then came December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. As the morning sky over Hawaii exploded with fire and chaos, dozens of Zero fighters screamed down from the clouds. Their engines roared like thunder. They moved in perfect coordination, slicing through the air with terrifying precision. American anti-aircraft gunners fired wildly, but the Zeros were too fast, too nimble. Within minutes, they destroyed wave after wave of U.S. aircraft on the ground. In those first months of war, the Zero became unstoppable. Over the Philippines, the Coral Sea, and the Indian Ocean, it reigned supreme. Allied pilots described it as a ghost in the sky, appearing from nowhere, twisting in impossible turns, and vanishing before they could aim. Its machine guns tore through enemy planes with deadly accuracy. For every Zero shot down, 5 or 6 Allied fighters fell. American intelligence was confused and terrified. How could Japan, once thought technologically inferior, create such a masterpiece of engineering? The Zero's secret lay in its extraordinary lightness. It weighed nearly a ton less than its American rivals, could fly over 1,500 miles without refueling, a range no other fighter could match. But that miracle came at a cost. To achieve such agility, Horikoshi's team had stripped away all armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. The Zero was fast but fragile. One lucky bullet could ignite it like paper. Yet, to the Japanese pilots of the early war, this was no weakness. It was a test of courage. They believed that skill and spirit would protect them where metal could not. One of those pilots was Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, a name that would soon become legend. In the skies over the Pacific, he fought with unmatched precision. On one mission, outnumbered by a squadron of American planes, Sakai shot down 4 enemies before his own plane was riddled with bullets. Blinded in one eye, bleeding heavily, he still managed to fly 600 miles back to base, landing his crippled Zero safely. His courage embodied the heart of the aircraft he flew. For nearly 2 years, the Zero ruled the sky. Every American pilot who faced it feared its turning ability. The U.S. military even issued orders. Do not dogfight a Zero. Dive and run. The legend of invincibility spread quickly. Newspapers called it the Sky Samurai, and to the Japanese people, it became a symbol of national pride, proof that their empire could challenge the West. But victories have a way of blinding those who win. By late 1942, cracks began to appear. At Guadalcanal and Midway, the Zero met new American tactics, hit-and-run attacks, superior radar coordination, and evolving aircraft like the F-4F Wildcat. The once unstoppable Zero now faced pilots who studied its every move, learning how to use its weaknesses against it. Still, in these early years, it remained the king of the skies, a monarch reigning over clouds and chaos. Back in Japan, Horikoshi received news of every battle. Each victory brought celebration, but each loss weighed heavier on him. He knew the truth. The Zero's perfection was an illusion, one built on sacrifice. His engineers had achieved what the Navy demanded, but they had created a weapon that left no room for mistakes. He once wrote in his journal, "The Zero was built for a nation that expected its sons to die." Meanwhile, American pilots, eager to understand their elusive enemy, began capturing fragments of crashed Zeros, bits of wing, engine parts, even bullets that failed to penetrate its thin skin. They studied them obsessively, searching for answers. But the full picture remained a mystery. Until one day, in 1942, a fully intact Zero was discovered on an isolated island, abandoned after an emergency landing. That discovery, as we heard in Chapter 1, would change everything. For now, however, in 1941 and 1942, the Zero was the undisputed ruler of the Pacific. Its roar echoed over the seas like a battle cry. From the jungles of Burma to the blue waters of Midway, Allied troops would look to the sky and whisper in fear, "Zero incoming." The aircraft's white fuselage gleamed like a phantom in the sun, its pilot focused, unshakable. To them, there was no retreat, no surrender, only victory or death. The Bushido Code, ancient and unwavering, lived in every turn, every dive, every shot fired. The world had never seen a fighter like it. The Zero was not just an airplane. It was a symbol of ambition, of courage, and of a nation reaching for the impossible. And for a time, it truly was the king of the skies. The midday sun hung heavy over the island, burning through a haze of salt and smoke. The once silent jungle was now alive with the buzz of generators and the distant chatter of Marines. It had been 2 days since the discovery, the strange, perfectly intact Japanese Zero fighter hidden in a clearing. Word of the find had spread fast. What began as a curious report from a Marine patrol had turned into an official investigation. Now, Engineers, intelligence officers, and Navy mechanics surrounded the aircraft, each man eager to uncover the secrets of Japan's most feared weapon. Corporal James Turner stood near the wing, watching as a group of officers circled the plane. He had been among the first to find it, and even now, he couldn't shake his astonishment. The Zero looked fragile, almost too delicate for war. Its thin aluminum skin glistened under the sunlight like the surface of a tin can. "Can't believe this thing ruled the skies," one of the mechanics muttered, shaking his head. Captain Reynolds, the lead intelligence officer, crouched beside the fuselage and tapped the side with a wrench. Clang. The sound was hollow, almost brittle. He frowned and tapped again. "That's unbelievable," he whispered. "There's nothing here. No plating. No armor protection of any kind." The Marines glanced at each other. "You mean no armor?" "None at all," Turner asked. Reynolds nodded. "Not a single panel of it. Even the cockpit's bare. This entire plane is built for one thing, speed." He motioned to the cockpit, where another officer had removed the seat cushion. There was no steel plate behind it, no reinforced wall, just a thin metal shell. The bullet holes from previous skirmishes would have gone straight through. "How in the hell did those pilots survive up there?" someone whispered. Reynolds looked up. Most of them didn't. For hours, the team worked in silence, taking notes, removing panels, and sketching diagrams. They documented everything: the light alloy structure, the thin wing ribs, the small fuel tank, unprotected and dangerously exposed. When one of the engineers cut open a section of the tank, a faint chemical smell filled the air. "Not self-sealing," he confirmed. "One tracer round hits this thing. It's over." By late afternoon, the realization sank in: this plane, which had haunted American skies for 2 long years, was built like a paper bird. It was both brilliant and suicidal. Its genius lay not in its strength, but in its vulnerability. Lieutenant Baker, a veteran pilot who had fought against the Zero over the Coral Sea, arrived to see it for himself. He walked around the aircraft slowly, touching the smooth aluminum skin. His expression was half admiration, half disbelief. "So that's what we've been fighting," he said quietly. "No wonder it turned so fast. It weighs nothing." He climbed into the cockpit and looked around. The instruments were simple: airspeed, altitude, fuel gauge, no armor glass, no heavy reinforcement. "It's stripped bare," Baker said, almost in awe. "This thing's a race car, not a war machine." A younger Marine laughed nervously. "Guess those Japanese pilots didn't plan on coming home." Baker didn't smile. "They didn't," he said softly. The room went quiet again. Outside, a few men began to carefully photograph every inch of the aircraft. The intelligence team knew what they were seeing wasn't just a plane. It was a window into Japan's war philosophy. Every design decision, every compromise, spoke volumes about the mindset of its creators. Captain Reynolds gathered his men around. "Gentlemen," he began, "what you see here is why we've been losing dogfights. This aircraft can outturn any of ours because it's half the weight. But it pays a terrible price. No protection for the pilot, no protection for the fuel. The Japanese built a weapon of perfection, but only for men willing to die in it." The Marines stood in silence, the words sinking in. It wasn't just technology they were facing, it was ideology. The Bushido spirit, the code of honor that valued sacrifice above survival, had shaped this machine. It was a weapon built from faith, not fear. Later that evening, the engineers removed the engine cowling, revealing the heart of the beast, a Nakajima Sakai 12 radial engine, polished and precise. Despite the plane's fragile frame, the engine was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. It had powered the Zero across oceans, over islands, through countless battles. Turner stared at it, amazed. "It's like they put a lion inside a birdcage," he said. Reynolds nodded. "Exactly. Pure power. Trapped inside something that can't take a punch." As night fell, the investigation team gathered around a table under a canvas tent. Papers, sketches, and measurements covered every inch. The Zero had given up its secrets, but what it revealed was almost tragic. A story of brilliance driven by desperation. One of the engineers leaned back and said quietly, "It's beautiful in a way. Terrifying, but beautiful." Baker nodded. "Yeah, but I wouldn't want to fly it." The next day, the Zero was loaded onto a transport plane and sent to Pearl Harbor for deeper study. As the engines roared to life, Turner looked back at the clearing where it had rested. It seemed smaller now, almost fragile, as if the jungle might swallow it whole. He thought of the pilot, the man who had flown that plane through storms of bullets with nothing between him and death but a sheet of metal. He wondered what kind of courage or madness could make a man climb into something so defenseless. Hours later, as the transport plane disappeared into the distance, Reynolds wrote his report. His final line read simply, "The enemy's greatest weapon is not his machine, it is his will." And in that moment, the Marines finally understood the truth behind the legend of the Zero. It wasn't invincible because it was armored. It was feared because it wasn't. The Pacific air was thick with heat as a group of U.S. Marine engineers gathered around the captured Zero fighter. The aircraft rested awkwardly in the sand, its nose buried slightly, its once brilliant paint dulled by salt and sun. What had once been a weapon of terror now stood silent, a mystery waiting to be unraveled. The Marines called in aviation experts from the Navy and Army Air Forces, and soon a small team of engineers and pilots arrived to study what had been, until recently, the most feared aircraft in the world. For the Americans, this was an extraordinary opportunity. Until that point, the Zero had been surrounded by myth. Pilots reported its impossible maneuverability, its uncanny climbing ability, and its deadly precision. Now, for the first time, they had a complete, largely intact example. The engineers knew that whatever secrets it held could change the course of the air war in the Pacific. The investigation began cautiously. They photographed every inch of the fighter before touching a single bolt. Then, carefully, they started to disassemble it. As the outer panels came off, the engineers exchanged looks of disbelief. The aluminum skin was so thin that one could almost dent it with a thumb. Inside the fuselage, there was no armor, no steel plate behind the pilot's seat, no protective bulkheads, no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was a machine built for one purpose: speed and range at any cost. One of the engineers, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, a test pilot from the U.S. Navy, ran his hand along the fuel lines. "It's like flying a tin can filled with gasoline," he muttered. Others nodded grimly. The Japanese designers had sacrificed everything that made an aircraft safe in the name of performance. It was both genius and madness. When they examined the engine, a Nakajima Sakai radial, the Americans were surprised. It wasn't particularly powerful, only around 940 horsepower, far less than the massive engines used in American fighters like the F-4F Wildcat or P-40. Yet somehow the Zero had outperformed them. The secret was clear now: weight. Every part of the Zero had been engineered to be as light as possible. Even the rivets were smaller and thinner than those used in American planes. In the cockpit, they found another shock. The controls were simple, almost primitive compared to American standards. There were no complex hydraulic systems. Everything was mechanical, direct, and lightweight. The throttle was smooth but fragile, the stick movement precise. It became clear that this aircraft was not meant to absorb damage or protect its pilot. It was designed for the pilot to never be hit in the first place. As the investigation deepened, the engineers began to admire the brilliance behind the design. They built this thing around the pilot's instincts, one of them remarked. It's not about the machine, it's about the man flying it. They realized the Zero was an extension of its pilot's skill. In the hands of a master, it could dance through the air with grace and lethality that few machines could match. But in the hands of an inexperienced pilot, it was a death trap. Soon, the captured Zero was transported to a U.S. base for full testing. At a secret location on the island of Oahu, mechanics reassembled it piece by piece. Every screw, every wire was measured, documented, and compared to American standards. When they finally got the engine running, the distinct whine of the Sakai filled the air, a sound that had once haunted Allied pilots over the Pacific. Test pilots took turns flying the Zero, pushing it to its limits. They were astonished. The aircraft could turn inside nearly anything the Americans had in service. Its controls were feather-light, its response immediate. But they also confirmed its fatal weaknesses. A single burst from a .50 caliber gun could shred its thin structure. A hard dive could tear off its wings. And any attempt to absorb battle damage was futile. The Zero simply wasn't built for survival. The engineers sent their findings back to Washington, where intelligence officers compiled a detailed report. It was titled Preliminary Analysis of Japanese Zero Fighter and distributed to every U.S. squadron in the Pacific. For the first time, American pilots had a clear picture of what they were facing and how to defeat it. The key was not to fight on the Zero's terms. Never turn with it. Never dogfight it in close. Attack from above, dive through and climb away. Use speed and firepower, not agility. These insights would soon transform air combat in the Pacific. New tactics were developed. American aircraft were redesigned with stronger engines, better armor, and self-sealing tanks. The lessons learned from that one captured Zero shaped the creation of the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair, fighters that would ultimately sweep the Zero from the skies. But in that moment, as the engineers stood around the stripped-down frame of the Japanese fighter, they felt something deeper, a respect for the enemy's craftsmanship. This wasn't a crude machine. It was elegant, efficient, and purposeful, born from a culture that valued perfection in simplicity. The Zero wasn't just a plane. It was a philosophy made of metal. Late that night, as the test hangar grew quiet, Sanders looked at the plane one last time. Its skin shimmered faintly under the light, ghost-like. "She's beautiful," he whispered, "but deadly, built to win fast or die trying." The others nodded in silence. In that stillness, surrounded by the smell of oil and fuel, they understood the paradox of the Zero, a masterpiece of engineering, undone by its own perfection. And as the Pacific War raged on, those lessons would echo in every dogfight, every new aircraft design, and every young pilot's training manual. The investigation of that one abandoned fighter had changed everything. The moment when curiosity became understanding, and understanding became victory. The early morning sun hung low over the Pacific, glinting off the twisted remains of wrecked aircraft that dotted the shoreline. Among them, one fighter stood out, sleek, beautiful, and deadly. It was the Mitsubishi A6M0, a machine that had once ruled the skies. To anyone seeing it for the first time, it looked almost fragile. Thin metal skin, lightweight frame, a contradiction to its legendary reputation. But that was the very secret behind its dominance. The Zero had been designed with one uncompromising philosophy: speed over safety. When the Imperial Japanese Navy demanded a new carrier-based fighter in the late 1930s, their requirements were almost impossible. The aircraft had to outclimb, outturn, and outrun anything the enemy had, and it had to be able to operate far from home across the vast Pacific. To meet these goals, Japanese engineers at Mitsubishi faced a difficult choice. Weight had to be cut at all costs. Armor plates were discarded. Self-sealing fuel tanks were deemed unnecessary. Even the smallest bolt and panel were designed to be as light as possible. Jiro Horikoshi, the chief designer of the Zero, believed that agility and range would be the keys to air superiority. He imagined a fighter so light and responsive that a skilled pilot could dance through the sky, striking before the enemy even knew what had happened. The result was astonishing. The A6M-0 weighed nearly 2,000 pounds less than most American fighters of the same era. It could fly over 1,900 miles without refueling, an unheard-of range at the time. When the Zero first appeared in 1940, it stunned the world. In China, it swept the skies clean of opposition. When war erupted across the Pacific after Pearl Harbor, American pilots encountered the Zero for the first time and were shocked by its performance. It climbed faster, turned tighter, and seemed to defy gravity itself. Dogfights that would have been even matches before now ended in disaster for the Americans. But that breathtaking speed came at a terrible price. The very features that made the Zero a legend also made it a death trap. The thin aluminum skin that allowed it to maneuver so effortlessly offered no protection to its pilot. A single bullet could ignite the fuel tanks. A few well-placed hits, and the aircraft would disintegrate in flames. Japanese pilots knew this, but in the early years of the war they accepted it. To them, dying in battle was not a tragedy. It was honor. The Japanese high command prioritized range and agility over everything else because they believed the war would be decided in the early, lightning-fast stages of expansion. They expected quick victories, not a long, grinding conflict that would test endurance and production. In those early days, the Zero seemed unstoppable. Over the Philippines, Malaya, and the Coral Sea, it dominated the skies. American aircraft like the F-4F Wildcat and P-40 Warhawk simply couldn't match its speed or grace. But as the war dragged on, the weakness of the Zero's design began to show. The Americans learned to adapt. They realized they couldn't outturn the Zero, so they stopped trying. Instead, they developed new tactics. Boom and zoom attacks became standard. Dive from above, fire, and climb back up before the slower climbing Zero could react. The Americans also began fielding new aircraft designed with balance in mind, planes like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, built to survive damage and hit back harder. By 1943, the tables had turned. The same lightness that once gave the Zero superiority now made it obsolete. Pilots who once danced gracefully through the clouds now found themselves vulnerable, outgunned, and unable to withstand even a few hits. Japan tried to reinforce the design, adding minimal armor and fuel protection, but each addition made the Zero slower, and every pound of armor stripped it of the agility that had defined it. On remote islands across the Pacific, wrecked Zeros lay scattered like the bones of fallen birds. Some burned where they crashed. Others, like the one found by American Marines, seemed eerily preserved. Empty cockpits, faded paint, and the unmistakable smell of aviation fuel. To the Marines who examined them, it was both fascinating and horrifying. These aircraft had been built for victory through sacrifice. The phrase "speed over safety" was never officially written into Japanese doctrine, but it was the unspoken truth behind their engineering philosophy. The Zero was not designed to protect its pilot. It was designed to destroy the enemy before the enemy could shoot back. And in that cruel arithmetic of war, the pilot's life was simply part of the cost. Looking back, it's hard not to feel both awe and sadness. The Zero was a masterpiece of design, an aircraft that pushed the limits of technology for its time. Yet it was also a reflection of the ideology that created it. An empire racing toward war, willing to trade human lives for temporary glory in the skies. The Marines who stood beside that abandoned Zero could not have known the story behind its creation. But as they ran their hands across its thin metal skin, they could feel it, the obsession with speed, the sacrifice of safety, and the haunting echo of a philosophy that valued victory above life itself.